January 17, 1945, Lechfeld Airfield, Bavaria. The frozen earth cracked beneath the wheels of the Messerschmitt Me 262 as ground crew pushed the jet fighter toward the runway. Dawn had not yet broken. In the half-light before sunrise, the aircraft seemed almost otherworldly, sleek, wingless sharks of steel and aluminum, their twin Jumo turbines silent and cold. Oberst Heinrich Baer stood beside the cockpit, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air, watching as mechanics worked frantically to prepare his machine for flight. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees Celsius overnight. Ice crystals clung to the fuselage. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of Allied bombers could be heard, a deep, persistent drone that had become the constant soundtrack of German skies. Oberst Baer climbed into the cockpit. The instruments glowed faintly. He checked the fuel gauge. The needle sat just above empty. This was not how salvation was supposed to look. 2 years earlier, Adolf Hitler had stood before Nazi officials and proclaimed the Me 262 a war-winning weapon, die Wunderwaffe, the miracle that would sweep Allied aircraft from the skies and restore German air superiority. Reich Minister of Armaments Albert Speer had promised mass production. Reich Marshal Erwin Göring had declared it the key to Germany's final victory. Engineers at Messerschmitt had designed an aircraft that could fly faster than any fighter in existence, capable of speeds exceeding 870 kilometers per hour, nearly 200 kilometers per hour faster than the American P-51 Mustang. The jet age had arrived, and Germany had arrived first. But on this frozen morning in January 1945, Oberst Baer sat in his jet fighter and waited for fuel that would never come. The story of the Me 262 is the story of a nation that built the future but could not power it. It is the story of technological brilliance strangled by logistical collapse, of innovation rendered meaningless by the realities of total war. The Germans had claimed that jet fighters would save them. They had believed their own propaganda. They had watched the sleek machines roar down runways and pierce the clouds at impossible speeds, and they had convinced themselves that technology alone could overcome the material weight of the world arrayed against them. They were wrong. The first prototype of the Me 262 had flown in July 1942, 3 years into a war Germany was already beginning to lose. Fighter pilot Fritz Wendel had taken the aircraft into the sky above Leipheim and felt the future beneath his hands, smooth, powerful, responsive. There were problems, of course. The Jumo 004 engines were temperamental. They overheated. They required constant maintenance. Their operational lifespan was measured in hours, not months. But these were engineering challenges, solvable problems. What mattered was the speed, the potential, the promise that Germany could outthink, out-engineer, out-innovate its enemies. Hitler had seen the Me 262 demonstrated in November 1943. He had watched it slice through the air and immediately demanded that it be converted into a fighter bomber, a blitz bomber, capable of carrying bombs to strike Allied invasion forces. The engineers had protested. The aircraft was designed as an interceptor, they explained, built to destroy enemy bombers, not to carry ordnance. Converting it would delay production by months, perhaps years. Hitler had dismissed their objections. The aircraft must carry bombs, he insisted. I will have no other answer. And so the Me 262 program was delayed, redesigned, refocused. Months turned into a year. By the time the first operational units began receiving the aircraft in the summer of 1944, the war had already turned irrevocably against Germany. The Normandy invasion had succeeded. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. Allied bombers flew over German cities in formations so vast they darkened the sky. The Me 262 was no longer a weapon that could change the war's course. It was a symbol of desperation, a technological marvel arriving too late to matter. But the Germans still believed. They had to believe, because without the Me-262, there was nothing left but defeat. Pilots who flew the jet described an experience unlike anything in aviation history. Lieutenant Heinz Knocke, who transitioned from the Bf-109 to the Me-262 in late 1944, recalled the first moment he activated the turbines. "The sound was like a continuous scream," he wrote in his diary. "Not the coughing roar of a piston engine, but something smoother, higher, almost inhuman. When I released the brakes and the aircraft began to move, I felt as though I had been strapped to a rocket. The acceleration was staggering. Within seconds, I was airborne. Within a minute, I was at altitude. I looked down and the world seemed to have shrunk beneath me." In combat, the Me-262 was devastating when it could fly. Allied pilots reported encounters with German jets that appeared out of nowhere, attacking bomber formations at speeds that made interception nearly impossible. The four 30mm Mk-108 cannons mounted in the nose could shred a B-17 Flying Fortress in a single burst. American and British pilots watched helplessly as their comrades' aircraft disintegrated under fire from machines they could neither catch nor outmaneuver. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Germans had indeed created something that could turn the tide. But those moments were rare, increasingly rare, because by January 1945, the Me-262 units were grounded not by enemy action, but by something far simpler. They had no fuel. Germany's oil supply had been the Achilles heel of its war effort from the beginning. The nation produced almost no petroleum domestically. It relied on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into gasoline through a complex chemical process developed in the 1920s. These plants were massive, expensive, and critically vulnerable. They required enormous amounts of water, electricity, and raw materials, and by 1944 they had become the primary targets of Allied strategic bombing. On May 12, 1944, the United States Army Air Forces launched Operation Frantic Anvil, a coordinated campaign to destroy Germany's synthetic fuel production. Over the following months, American B-17s and B-24s, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustangs, struck fuel plants across Germany and occupied territories. The Lerna facility near Meersburg, which produced more synthetic fuel than any other plant in Europe, was bombed 22 times between May and December 1944. The Politz plant was hit 19 times, Bolin 15 times. Each raid reduced production. Each raid forced the Germans to divert resources to repair and rebuild. Each raid tightened the noose around the Luftwaffe's operational capacity. By September 1944, German aviation fuel production had fallen to 22% of its April levels. By December, it had dropped to 7%. The Me-262 units, which required a special grade of fuel to operate their turbine engines, found themselves competing with conventional fighter squadrons, armored divisions, and even civilian heating oil for dwindling supplies. Priority lists were drawn up, revised, then abandoned as reality overwhelmed planning. Pilots sat in ready rooms and waited for fuel deliveries that never arrived. Ground crews drained tanks from damaged aircraft to fill operational ones. Mechanics siphoned fuel from trucks and staff cars, hoping to gather enough for a single sortie. The symbolic irony was crushing. Germany had built the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. It had trained pilots to fly them. It had established bases, organized squadrons, developed tactics. And yet these machines sat motionless on runways, their fuel tanks empty, rendered useless not by enemy skill, but by the simple mathematics of industrial warfare.
Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commander of Jagdverband 44, an elite unit equipped exclusively with Me-262s, described the situation in his post-war memoir. "We had 30 aircraft," he wrote. "On a good day, we could put 5 in the air. On most days, we could manage 2 or 3. Not because the planes were damaged, not because the pilots were unavailable, but because we had no fuel. We would receive reports that fuel was being shipped from storage depots hundreds of kilometers away. We would wait. The fuel would never arrive. Intercepted by partisan attacks, diverted to other units, or simply consumed by the trucks attempting to deliver it. We were the future of aviation, grounded by the past." The contrast with their enemy was stark and humiliating. American pilots flew missions over Germany in aircraft that, while slower and less technologically advanced, never lacked for fuel. The United States produced more petroleum in a single month than Germany's synthetic plants could manufacture in an entire year. American supply lines stretched across oceans but functioned with ruthless efficiency. Fuel arrived at forward bases in England, France, and Italy in quantities that seemed impossible to German observers. It arrived on schedule. It arrived in surplus. American pilots did not ration their fuel. They did not calculate whether they had enough to reach the target and return. They simply flew. Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace who survived the war, recalled watching American bomber formations from the ground in early 1945. "They flew in perfect formation," he said in an interview decades later. "Hundreds of aircraft, engines synchronized, burning fuel at a rate we could not comprehend. I thought about the Me-262s sitting in the hangars behind me. I thought about the technology we had created. And I realized that none of it mattered. They had abundance. We had ingenuity. Abundance won." This was the lesson the Germans learned too late, that wars are not won by the best weapons, but by the most weapons, fueled, maintained, and deployed. The Me-262 could outfly any Allied fighter. It could destroy any Allied bomber. But it could not conjure fuel from empty tanks. It could not overcome the fundamental disparity between a nation that controlled the world's oil and a nation that depended on chemical substitutes.
There is a recurring image in the accounts of Me-262 pilots from the final months of the war, the sight of Allied fighter bombers strafing German airfields, destroying parked jets that could not take off to defend themselves. The Americans and British had learned that the Me-262, despite its speed advantage, was vulnerable during takeoff and landing when its engines spooled up slowly and the aircraft could not maneuver effectively. P-51 Mustangs and Hawker Tempests would orbit above German jet bases, waiting for the Me-262s to attempt flight, then dive on them in those crucial seconds when the jets were neither fast enough to escape nor agile enough to fight back. But increasingly, the Allied pilots found there was no need to wait. The Me-262s simply sat on the ground, silent and still. On one raid against Lechfeld in March 1945, American pilots reported counting more than 60 Me-262s lined up along the taxiways, intact, undamaged, abandoned. They strafed them methodically, destroying aircraft that had never flown, that would never fly, that existed only as monuments to ambition outpaced by reality. The fuel crisis had cascading effects. Without fuel for training flights, new pilots arrived at Me-262 squadrons with minimal jet experience. The Me-262 was notoriously difficult to fly, its engines prone to flame out if throttled incorrectly, its high landing speed unforgiving of mistakes. Inexperienced pilots crashed on takeoff, they crashed on landing, they crashed attempting maneuvers that conventional aircraft could execute safely. Each crash destroyed an irreplaceable machine. Each crash wasted fuel that could have been used for combat sorties. The operational readiness of Me-262 units spiraled downward. By April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin and American armies advanced from the west, the remaining Me-262 squadrons were scattered across southern Germany, flying what amounted to suicide missions with whatever fuel they could scavenge. Pilots took off knowing they might not have enough fuel to return. Some landed at random airfields, begging ground crews for enough fuel to reach their home bases. Some ran out of fuel in flight and glided their jets to rough landings in fields and forests, abandoning the aircraft where they fell. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most celebrated fighter aces and the final commander of Jagdverband 44, flew his last Me-262 mission on April 26, 1945. He shot down an American bomber, his 104th confirmed kill. When he landed, there was no fuel for another sortie. The war ended 12 days later. In total, approximately 1,400 Me-262s were built. Fewer than 300 saw combat. Of those, perhaps 150 were lost to enemy action. The rest were destroyed on the ground, abandoned, or scrapped. The jet fighter that was supposed to save Germany had instead become a symbol of its industrial and strategic collapse, a testament to the limits of innovation without resources, of vision without means. There is a final scene worth considering. After the war ended, Allied intelligence teams swept across Germany, cataloging weapons, interrogating engineers, assessing technology. They found warehouses filled with Me-262 components, engines, fuselages, wings, waiting for assembly. They found factories designed to produce hundreds of jets per month, staffed with workers who had no materials to work with. They found design documents for even more advanced aircraft, the Horten HM-229 Flying Wing and the Heinkel HE-162 Volksjäger, projects that would never leave the drawing board.
And they found fuel depots, empty except for rust and echoes. The Americans and British took what they wanted. They shipped Me-262s back to laboratories in the United States and England, where they were studied, tested, and dissected. The knowledge gained from German jet technology accelerated Allied jet development, influencing the design of the F-86 Sabre and other post-war aircraft. The Germans had pioneered the future, and their conquerors inherited it. But standing in those empty hangars, walking through those silent factories, the Allied investigators understood something the Germans had learned too late. The Me-262 was a magnificent machine. It was also irrelevant. Because a weapon that cannot be fueled, cannot be flown, cannot be sustained, is not a weapon. It is a monument to hubris. The jet fighters were supposed to save Germany. They were supposed to restore air superiority, halt the bomber offensive, turn the tide of a war already lost. They were supposed to prove that German engineering could overcome material disadvantage, that technology could substitute for resources, that willpower could replace logistics. Instead, they sat on runways with empty tanks, their turbines cold, their potential unrealized. They had become artifacts before they could become saviors. The lesson is simple and brutal. Wars are won not by the best ideas, but by the capacity to implement them. Innovation means nothing without industry. Technology means nothing without fuel. The future means nothing if you cannot afford to reach it. The Germans claimed jet fighters would save them, but salvation requires more than speed. It requires sustenance. And when the fuel ran out before takeoff, all that remained was the quiet understanding that they had built wonders they could not use, designed miracles they could not power, and dreamed futures they would never inhabit. The Me-262 was the tomorrow Germany never reached, grounded forever in a yesterday it could not escape.